Good morning, good afternoon. My name is Robert Schmid, also known as Mr. IoT. I'm the Chief IoT Technologist for Deloitte with a deep passion for all things digital. This week on Coffee with Mr. IoT, Kelsey and I are talking with Kristin Russell, the president at Arrows for Global Services. And I nicknamed it, Kristin is making IoT. You are making devices. Welcome to the show, Kristin. How are you?
Thank you. Thank you, Robert. Thank you, Kelsey. It's great to be on. I'm super excited to finally make this happen and be with you guys here today. So thank you.
Well, it's great to have you. Actually, you and I met at Deloitte. We're still not quite sure at what event exactly, but you actually worked for Deloitte before you were at Arrow. So I guess it's a little welcome back, and it's great to have you on. Let's start with this. Arrow. I know you and I talked about this before, and you're a Fortune 500 company, but you're sort of like one of the ones that are always supporting all the other ones. Tell us what you do.
Yeah, so I like to say that Arrow is kind of the biggest company that no one's ever heard of, right? So it's a Fortune 118 company, about $27 billion in revenue. And we got our start, believe it or not, in Manhattan on Radio Row, and we were schlepping radio parts. That was like the killer app or the killer technology at the time. And from that time period, we've been around for 83 years. And from that time period, we really started to evolve from just a components, electronics, technology distribution company into really being a technology platform company. And we did a study that said that by the time you've had your morning cup of coffee, you've touched, something that has been made or that we've been a part of making 7 times, and jumps up to 12 times before you've had lunch. So Arrow is really, we like to think of ourselves as kind of the Sherpa behind helping companies innovate and get products out to market.
So Kristin, great to meet you. I mean, you mentioned that it's an 83-year-old company, so clearly you've seen a lot of transition and revolution in technology. How would you describe the last, 3 to 5 years and really what's happening and how that's impacting Arrow?
Yeah, it's great. It's funny that you use the time frame of 3 to 5 years, because we have this slogan at Arrow that says 5 years out. And I get asked all the time, what does 5 years out mean? It seems so kind of ethereal. And we believe that 5 years out is kind of where the practical meets the possible. And if you think about technology, if you talk about what's going to happen next year, you're already behind. It's already done and gone. But if you try to think about technology in 10 to 15 years, I don't think anybody really knows what's going to happen in that time horizon. So we like to think about 5 years out as the practical future of what's going to happen with technology. And we've really evolved. I mean, I learn every single day. Robert, you mentioned I've just been with the company for about 2.5 years, and I learn every single day about the things that Arrow does and where we're engaged with technology. But we have, for example, the largest publication going out to engineers. We have partnerships with Indiegogo where new innovators and entrepreneurs will actually come to Arrow and we'll help test their ideas. We have engineers that will help them get from prototype to production. And my team in particular is part of an emerging transformation for the company to really add services where companies are struggling with either supply chain or how does hardware and software get integrated, all the way to sustainability and end of life. And so there's a lot of new things that are creating complexity for people. I mean, I think we think about that as technology evolves and IoT and AR and AI and all of these things happen, that we're simplifying maybe the world from a consumer perspective, but we're actually adding a lot of complexity to businesses that are trying to wrestle with new technologies. And Arrow's really trying to be on the forefront of that and helping companies to simplify their technology lifecycle experience.
So you said by the time I had my coffee, by the way, I took out the Denver cup today for you.
Good.
I'm hiding the advertisement, but I got this many, many moons ago.
Great.
So by the time I've had my coffee, I touched 7 Aero products. Tell me one of the exciting IoT products in particular that you'd like to talk about. As I said, you guys are making IoT happen in a way. I often talk to software people and we forget that there's this whole side of sensors and actual hardware that captures all the data. And so tell me of one that you find particularly interesting that you make, and maybe a story about it. I'd love that.
Yeah, so great. So I get the opportunity to work with these incredible innovators and entrepreneurs out there. And as you said, with all the advancements of technology, we haven't figured out how to run software without hardware, right? So there is the necessary evil of these two things coming together. I was just recently in Israel, in Tel Aviv, and I have a center in Tel Aviv, and I had the opportunity to meet with this company who is trying to disrupt and innovate around the dental industry, which you're thinking, my gosh, I mean, that industry has been around for, hundreds of thousands of years, it seems like. And we haven't really innovated too much with that industry over time. And so they're really creating a lot of disruption in the dental industry. And this company out of Tel Aviv is doing this. They've created this IoT edge device, if you can say, called Smart Mirror. So when you go into the dentist's office and the dental hygienist has that long kind of instrument with a little mirror on the little entered mirror, and then they go around and try to do things in your mouth. So this man who actually has been an innovator and entrepreneur his whole life on the tech side. His wife's a dental hygienist. And his wife was talking about this. It's dark and you can't really use this, and it's just metal. And so you're using the reflection of the metal, and it's not very innovative and or productive or whatever. And so he was like, there's got to be a better way, right? That's the whole thing with entrepreneurs. There's got to be a better way. So he actually worked with Aero to create what he's calling Smart Mirror, and the company is actually out there. It's called the Smart Mirror Company. And instead of just metal, this instrument, he actually created, he put tiny LED lights on the end of that, and then a camera. And so what happens now is, instead of the hygienist looking around and then putting it down and making notes, they can actually do all of the data reckoning right from the device. And so they're working with my team to not only build the actual smart mirror, but then the smart mirror actually sits on a compute, almost like with your Apple Watch sitting on your charger at night. That smart mirror sits on a NUC that then ends up taking the data from the actual, appliance, and then sends it to the cloud so that they can do all sorts of analytics and history gathering on not only that patient, but what they're seeing across their entire portfolio of customers. Super interesting things like that you wouldn't think about, but that's just one story of many about how we're helping companies get to market.
It's such a great story, and really a wonderful application when you think about healthcare. And the thing I really liked about your story, though, was the fact that the spouse actually was probably part of the thought behind it and the user needs and all of that. And so, as you in this leadership role at Aero, I mean, what things do you kind of bring from home or wish you had that were connected or could do some of that? I mean, share a little bit about what you like to do and kind of how you see your world of personal and professional colliding.
Yeah, so I've been in tech for the vast majority of my career, so I just really love to think about kind of what is possible. And I think where we see things is, as you said, as consumers, as mothers, as sisters, as as spouses, and in our own homes. Wouldn't it be great if? And then that creates this idea for something new and different. I have 2 daughters, and my oldest actually just started school at William and Mary in Virginia. And so, our lives are constantly surrounded about technology. I mean, I think about how different this generation is in terms of their usage of technology and how that's actually impacting our lives in a very different way than what they had. And I'll give you a funny story. This just happened last night. So my daughter texts me and says, Mom, how do I make a turkey in the microwave? And I was like, what? Like, this is the one at college. And I said, well, you don't do that. That's a really bad idea. And she goes on and she's like, yeah. And so then I start like freaking out. Like, I'm like, I've got to help her. So I start Googling, okay, you can go down the street and you can go to Honey Baked Ham and I'll call them and you can pick up a turkey. You're not going to do this microwave thing. Well, as it turns out, it's a big joke on Instagram, right? So these kids are texting their mothers and saying, how do I make this turkey in the microwave? And then they're posting all their responses on Instagram so everybody can laugh about this. And I mean, it's a silly example, but that's the power of kind of technology. And like, we can have this complete social movement going on something really interesting and ridiculous. And yet enjoy it at the same point in time.
Okay, I don't know. That's one of the best stories I've heard in a long time. I now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna connect my son's Instagram to my texting so that I capture those kind of things.
Exactly, right? Exactly. But in all seriousness, I mean, the thing that we are doing at Arrow is really interesting. We just bought a company called eInfoChips that is actually helping companies do software application development with all the data that they're getting from the intelligent edge, from IoT, and how do they make sense of that, and how do they use that platform to be able to API back into their systems, and that's a software development organization that we really saw there's an opportunity, because the reality is if I always say IoT without a business case is just a science project. And just because we can doesn't mean that we should. And we've got to be really thoughtful about the fact that we have to use these new technologies in order to drive business outcomes. And I know, Robert, you and I have talked about this a lot, but it's really in the analysis of the data to actually drive business outcomes, to do one of three things. Either they're growing revenue, they're reducing cost, or they're reducing risk. And if you can't point to those types of outcomes, just because we can do these really cool things and, the smart mirror, or, we build the 3D scanners that go into, orthodontist's office, or, doing a lot of different things, you've got to make sure that there's a business case that makes sense, because that's where the economic value, there was a recent study that was sent out that said if we're supposed to get to the $11 trillion estimated economic value of the IoT market, that 85% of that is going to be in services and the analysis of data to drive business outcomes. And my concern is that, like with every technology wave, that companies will go out there and say, we're going to just blanket, we're going to darken the skies with a bunch of sensors and drones to get data. And it's like, okay, great, but to what purpose, right? And so we're really trying to help companies navigate through that kind of muddy water to, what are you really trying to do with this technology, and how is it going to benefit your customers or your shareholders or your employees?
I have to tell you, your analogies are making me all self-conscious. Darken the sky, the smart mirror. I'm like all afraid of laughing right now. But by the way, if you're just joining now, you're watching Coffee with Mr.IoT, and Kelsey, and my guest today is Kristin Russell, president at Arrow. Kristin, I wanted to ask you something different. You and I have a very similar background going back. We were both CIOs. You were the CIO at the state of Colorado. You then came to Deloitte. I'm still at Deloitte. You left. You've been going back and forth between corporate and consulting. Just tell us a little bit, sort of like, I wanted to ask you, for people watching that are maybe consultants, what's sort of like the difference, and what's the benefit of switching back and forth? I think you have a really interesting career path, and I always get asked about this, and I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I always, my career path has been very, you could call it circuitous or checkered past, however you want to say it. But it's definitely not been a traditional career path. Technology has been the one thing, that one thread that has carried me through from the very beginning. But I was always interested, I've always taken jobs for two reasons. And it's because I can teach and because I can learn. And there's something that I have done that I feel like that company could take advantage of, and there's value in that. And there's something I don't understand and that I really want to learn. And if you look back at kind of the different jobs that I've had, starting all the way back at the railroad, where I was doing, statistical process control design for the railroad. I mean, that's a very different, nobody goes to work at the railroad anymore. To Sun Microsystems, to Oracle, to the state of Colorado, to Deloitte. It's always been because there was something that I could teach and that I could learn. I think the difference, obviously, between like a consulting, like my time at Deloitte and my time at Arrow, is that I love the aspect of consulting where you are really working with a lot of different clients and internally as well, and really trying to be on the leading edge of thought-provoking strategies to help companies continue to move forward. I love that aspect of being at Deloitte. I thought that was fascinating because you can get a taste of all these different companies and industries and technologies, and you're constantly learning. I love being in a business role as a general manager and running a P&L, because you really have to roll up your sleeves, right? So as in consulting, you say, hey, here's my recommendation, and this is super interesting and unique. And then you kind of hope that they do what you want them to do. But running a business, it is you. So you have to roll up your sleeves and make constant day-to-day trade-offs, like, okay, do we want to give more money to marketing, or what's going on with human resources and training, and what's happening with selling. And so it's just they're two very, very different obvious worlds. But I really love the fact that kind of being a hands-on leader, I get to be in the thick of things, which is good and bad, but I like having that responsibility and like working and seeing kind of the fruits of my labor and the fruits of the team. And, I love to lead large organizations through transformation. I mean, that's kind of the constant as well in my career. And I feel like I can do that, from a corporate perspective, maybe a little bit more than I could in consulting.
So I have to ask you, I was going to ask you, what did you teach Arrow? But I thought that wasn't politically correct. So I'm going to ask you the other question, which is, what did you teach Deloitte? Or what do you think Andy Main would say you taught Deloitte?
Yeah, I mean, I think my background, when I was leading the digital government practice for Deloitte, was interesting because I came in as a buyer. Right, from a previous role of being a buyer as a CIO and Secretary of Technology at the state of Colorado. So I gave them perspective on really, what customers, Deloitte's customers were really looking for in terms of digital transformation, and what were the difficulties of that. And so I think that I hope that I taught Deloitte that, a different lens of that customer place, because I had been there. And, it's hard, I think, I always use the phrase with my team, it's difficult to explain the color blue to a blind person. And I think what I had done for Deloitte is I had been in that role, similar to you, right? As a former CIO, you actually know what it's like to sit in that seat. And that is hugely valuable when you are in an organization that's selling to that customer.
That's interesting, and I too came from outside of Deloitte, so it is. I completely agree to be in the seat of a buyer and really understand, what's the level of detail I'm going to get from these guys, and is it really going to be implementable, and all of that is so true. Kind of going back to something you said maybe a couple a couple minutes ago, you talked about what you're helping some of your downstream customers with, and you mentioned supply chain, you mentioned sustainability. What do you see as like the biggest challenge in some of your customers to overcoming and implementing either some of these ideas to generate the value that you talked about?
Yeah, so great question. I love that question, Kelsey, because I think that it's an interesting thing. What we're seeing in the market is that, and Robert, you mentioned it earlier, but a lot of our customers are focusing on the software layer as kind of their IP, right? And it's about how to get that software out into the market. And so, and yet, as I mentioned, we don't really know how to run software without hardware, or we don't know how to do that at all. And so a lot of times our customers, we're doing a lot of things in-house that they don't necessarily want to do in-house anymore. And I give the example that, you know, if you look at kind of some of the iconic brands that have been around for years and years and years, the Sears, the Compaq, the IBM, you know, the Coca-Cola, they did everything within the house because that was their secret sauce. So they had not a lot of things were outsourced to partners, right? They did their own payroll and their own IT and their own marketing and manufacturing and sales and everything. And that was really how the market was trying to differentiate against competitors. And then when technology hit, you know, if you would have gone to the likes of Hyatt and Hilton in 2008 and say, there's going to be a new market entrant within the next 2 years that is going to take your market share, and they're going to completely change the rules of hoteling, and they're not going to own a single piece of property. And obviously that was Airbnb. And then companies started to scramble, and you guys know the statistics as much as I do, that 50% of Fortune 500 aren't going to exist in the next 10 years. And so they started to figure out how did they need to innovate and transform. And so they started pushing a lot of things that, you know, they saw as non-core out of the house, IT, HR, payroll, those types of things. And what we're seeing in the future, what we see, and I think that our customers are telling us, is that now they're trying to make room for things that they never thought that they needed to in the past. You know, General Foods having to hire data scientists. They're a food company, but they're now saying, I have to figure out what AI is going to do and what blockchain and what all these new technologies are going to mean to my company. So that means that more and more of the things that I maybe even saw historically as core and strategic, I've got to leverage partners. So when we build up these services, we're really listening to our customers in terms of the things that they are struggling the most with. And those are supply chain, that is hardware and software integration. We're dealing with companies, major enterprises, that healthcare companies that say, you know, we've been building these kiosks to go into our network of pharmacies, but wait a second, we're a healthcare company. Or we talk to software companies all the time that we're building a full system and shipping it out to their customers, and they're like, wait a second, we're a software company. We're not a manufacturing, we're not a sustainability, we're not a managed services company, we're a software company. And so a lot of companies are coming to us to say, listen, we're struggling with end of life, right? So the whole sustainability thing is a major, major issue. It's impacting brands all the time around e-waste. And so they said, can we actually turn that problem over to you, Arrow, to make sure that you're recycling our system sustainably at a global scale, because we can no longer deal with the compliance risk that some of our systems are going to end up in landfill. And my team actually works with them and says, great, we will take care of that for you. We'll recycle it properly, we'll refurbish it, and we'll help you resell it if it has value back into the market, and we'll split the proceeds. They were doing all of these things internally, and then they said, why we can't deal with this complexity, because the world in the future is a lot more complex, and we're going to have to invest in other areas to be able to innovate and survive.
Since we started a few minutes late, I'm going to take a few minutes at the end. But as my last question, I want to come back to your looking forward. And what stuck with me was your phrase, when the practical meets the possible. what are the 2 or 3 most exciting things that you're looking forward to that you can't do today that are practical, but you can see them doing tomorrow?
Yeah, so a couple of things. I mean, you know, when we think about what's happening at the edge and we think about, you know, kind of the IT/OT convergence, I just, you know, I'd like more sophistication between that convergence, because I think that we are seeing kind of 2 different, you know, it's like we have people from different countries speaking different languages. And when I think about, you know, the opportunity that exists with those 2 things coming together, especially at the edge, and the amount of power that that could help us transform the world around us, I think we're behind in terms of how do we actually make that a lot more fluid and seamless and easier to rectify between these 2 different areas. So that would be the first thing. I think the second thing, and I'll go back to my, you know, Sundays, you know, Scott McNealy, you know, coined the phrase, the network is the computer, right? And when we think about what's happening, you know, the convergence and the, you know, the acceleration of data at the network level is, I think, a really, really big deal. And we have to figure out how to widen that pipe to be able to handle what we need to do, because it matters not necessarily just in terms of we need to get our you know, app loaded faster, but actually there's a lot bigger issues going on in the world that are more and more dependent on the network working. When I was at the CIO and Secretary of Technology for the state of Colorado, we had a lot of, you know, horrific things that happened. The Aurora, you know, theater shooting, the fires, the floods. You see that happening more and more at the global landscape, and it's more dependent on data getting to the right people at the right time for good purposes. And unfortunately, we are incredibly constrained. And I know people are saying, oh, well, 5G is going to help that. Well, 5G is, at least initially, is going to be, you know, very sanctioned across different types of industry and not necessarily all the way down to the consumer layer. And so that's the second thing. And then I think the third thing that I would say is, you know, I do think that we have to wrestle and solve this complexity between cyber and privacy, and, you know, what is the answer? And, you know, we're creating new rules where there's new things coming up. You know, I remember when I was at the state again and we legalized marijuana, right? And so it's like, you know, we're creating these new things that we have to create the rules, the rule book for. And I think as it pertains to cyber and privacy, I don't think that we figured it out. And you see a big pendulum being, you know, wave between like what's happening with GDPR and what's happening in the US and how that impacts cyber. And I think that would be the third one. So those are pretty lofty, Robert, in terms of like my wishes around technology, adaptation, and innovation. But I think those are important ones for us to really think through.
Well, thank you so much. I'm glad you threw in at the end to the cybersecurity and privacy, the Mariana piece. I can never say that word, by the way. My kids still make fun of me, but an interesting combo. Kristin, it was great to have you on the show. It looks like this break is coming to a close. Thank you so much for this. Lots and lots of great ideas. And please join Kelsey and I again, not next week because that's Thanksgiving and we're going to take time off, but the week after at 9 a.m. Pacific, noon Eastern, for another Coffee with Mr.IoT. And if you missed any part of today's conversation or any past shows, please check out my YouTube channel. And with that, I'm going to say happy Friday and thank you again. Bye.
Thank you. Bye. Thank you.